We said before that we get so many great questions coming into question time, and it's always hard to pick one for Joe, but that's the job of Steve Brennan. What have you got, Steve?
Yeah, we have been seeing some pretty strong employment job gains numbers coming out of the establishment report. A lot of people aren't believing them. And isn't there maybe some reason for some people to question just how strong those gains in the establishment report have been, Joe?
Well, maybe. Look, there's always a difference between the household report and the establishment survey. And most of the time, I don't pay a lot of attention to this because both of these things have big plus minus. If you want to think about it, just call it sampling error, call it whatever you want to call it. But the establishment survey is on a monthly basis is plus or minus 100,000. So if you get a number at 130,000 or 150,000 or even 272,000 like we did last week, well, maybe it's not 272,000, maybe it's 172,000, or alternatively, it could be that plus 130, it could be 400,000. We don't know. But I would just say that, listen, this is an area where you have to be really careful when you're reading this stuff and you're reading other analysts or commentators, or whatever you want to call them. And here's why. Oftentimes we see a difference in between the household report and the establishment report about how many jobs were created on the month. Now, the household report, you don't hear that number on the headlines. The number you hear in the headlines, hey, we got 272,000 jobs this month. That comes from the establishment survey, which is a survey of businesses, 130,000 businesses, whatever it is. And so that comes directly from the companies. The other survey, the household survey, is how they calculate the unemployment rate. And so that comes more out of the census. It has to do with population growth. It has to do with workforce growth, labor force participation, and all those things. But it also has in there a number that talks about how many jobs were, how many people were working during the month. So that number, though, is not plus 100. Well, actually, the establishment survey has said plus or minus 100,000. It's actually, I think, 130,000, but whatever. It's a big number. Yeah, the household survey, it's an even bigger number. It's plus or minus 600,000. So that number really doesn't mean all that much. And what happens is you get someone with a negative opinion about the economy. And just take this last month. You had a plus 272 on the establishment survey, a minus 400 and whatever the number was on the household survey. And everybody that's negative on the economy goes, see, the economy is not as good as everybody says it is. It's called confirmation bias. If you're negative, you look for the negative. If you're positive, you look for the positive. So all the bears say, hey, look at the household survey. It was terrible. And all the bulls go, hey, look at the establishment survey. It was great. And the truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. But I will say this. So on a month-to-month basis, I never pay any attention to the difference. It makes no difference. There's no way to figure out which one's right, which one's wrong. But now we've got a variance here that's pretty wide, from 2.5 million jobs in the establishment survey over the last year to 300 and something thousand in the household survey. That is a wide gap. And so this difference between these two surveys has persisted for a year now. So I do think, and we also have this quarterly report from the Census Bureau, which the wages survey and employment survey comes out quarterly, that looks like the establishment survey has been overstating things. But let's be really clear about this. We're not saying that there's no job creation, that we're losing hundreds of thousands of jobs a month, like the household survey says, or like it said this last month. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, and what this quarterly report just said, is that, yeah, maybe it's not 250,000 a month, maybe it's 170, 190, something like that. Well, I got to tell you, 170, 190, that's still a pretty good number. So all we're saying here is that you can't look at these numbers on a month-to-month basis and say, that's the way the world is. That is the absolute, it's perfect. It's the way things are, because it does not work that way. All these numbers are going to get revised. They're going to get revised 3, 4, 5 times. They do annual benchmark revisions. There's tons of revisions. By the time you get 5 years down the road, you're going to look at that number, and in a lot of cases, you're going to look at a number that was a positive, and it's going to come out, it's going to be a negative. And sometimes you're going to see one from 4 or 5 years ago that was a negative when it first got reported, and now it's a positive. You can't rely on these things. I have no idea. It blows my mind that people put so much emphasis on these employment reports on a monthly basis when they aren't even close to accurate. Look, go back and look at 2008. Everybody talks about, oh, well, I'm going to figure out when the recession starts. Yeah, you're not going to do it from employment data. That's not going to happen. If you go back and look at 2007, when the recession started in December 2007, man, the labor market looked fine. So did everything else, by the way. That's another thing. You got to be careful when you look at any data. If you're going back and using historical data, and like, for instance, for a recession start date, you got to realize that recession start date wasn't set until a couple of years later. That was someone at the National Bureau of Economic Research looking backwards and saying, here's where it started, even though there was nothing in the data at the time that looked recessionary. So when you look back at past data, it's all been revised, it's all been cleaned up, and all looks great, and it's certain, it looks easy. All I have to do is look at this, and it's going to be simple, and I'll be able to figure out when the recession starts. I'll be able to sell all my stocks and buy a bunch of bonds. I'm going to be great. It does not work that way. So just be careful and think about things. You got to have a trend, and you got to pay attention to revisions. Look, every month when they release a new employment report, they tell you what the revisions were for the previous month and the month before that and the month before that. And even those are still not accurate, but at least they tell you which direction the corrections are going. You need to pay attention to this stuff, because you're going to end up making a mistake in your portfolio by acting on something that isn't even true. So look, yes, the establishment survey has probably been overstating job gains to some degree, but there's differences in these things too. I'll give you one last piece of info that's not included in the household survey, or not included in the establishment survey, is immigration. Look, we don't know exactly what the population is on any given month. And we don't know when those companies report that they've got this many people working. When they do the establishment survey, they don't ask them about their immigration status. They don't say, is it a citizen or a non-citizen? Because the company doesn't care. The company just needs a worker. So you're not catching that. And so there's all these other things going on behind the scenes that you don't know about, and you don't need to know about. Pay attention to the market. Listen, the market is wisdom of crowds, right? Look, if the economy is terrible, I'm telling you, interest rates will be going down. And they're not, just so you know. So try to pay attention to what matters. What matters is the market. The market will tell you when things go south, and they'll tell you when things are getting better. Just pay attention and don't worry too much about the month to month, week to week, these economic reports. Look at them and take them all with a giant grain of salt.
Put your questions in the comments section below and see just how fired up you can get Joe.